So let's first off just having everyone who hasn't gotten up here yet. So Kenn and Kristen, just introduce yourself and your role and your background with developer experience.
So Kenn Hussey, VP Engineering for Ambassador. Been developing since grade school. Remember being at the CTO office at IBM about 20 years ago talking about how RESTful APIs were going to be a big thing. Fast forward to today, and I'm running a team of engineers building solutions to help improve the developer experience for API developers.
Hello, I'm Kristen Womack, and in my current role, I am an API or a developer product manager. I've basically worked with developer products for most of my career, and right now I'm working on a CLI tool to help developers that are working in the developer workflow to deploy to Azure in ways that are less atomic to each resource, but more natural to the developer workflow, like AZD deploy or AZD up or AZD pipeline configs. And before that, I was running Microsoft Graph developer experience team, so all the tools and the documentation and everything you would use to build with Microsoft Graph, which is one of the largest APIs in the entire world. I ran the API platform for Best Buy, both internal and external, and learned a lot about how when you build for 3P, you really make life of a developer that is inside the company, first party, have a much better experience building for all the products. So that is one thing that I think is important to highlight when you talk about developer experience, and you were kind of like expanding the aperture there. That was really, really cool. Lots of hackathons, lots of things around developers as my customer.
Fantastic. And a brief intro for you for the recording.
Yeah, so I'm Kristof from Tomme. I'm CEO of PRONOVIX. We're a company specialized in building developer portals, and it's now 9 years that we've been writing about developer experience, and so a lot of thinking and talking with people and figuring out how this all works.
Yeah, fantastic. So when you think of developer experience, it seems like there's a lot of parallels to traditional user experience. I'd like to unpack that. Is it similar to user experience? If so, how so? And if not, what are the differences? Maybe let's just start over here with Kenn.
Sure, yeah. So to me, developer experience, broadly speaking, is about interactions, right? What are the interactions that a developer has with the people, the tools, the processes in their day-to-day workflow? So to me, I think of it as a very broad thing, but developers are users too, right? They're users of tools and APIs, and so to me, UX is a subset of DX in the sense that you're talking about what are those interactions with a given tool or product like. But developer experience, like I say, is a much broader thing.
Yeah, I think that there are some similarities, but user experience tends to be more of a track, like getting somebody from one point to the end point and keeping them on that track to completing whatever that is, a purchase or some type of transaction with your business. And developer experience could be similar in like signing up for APIs or in getting started. But the way that we think a lot about developer experience in my role is how do you make the interface in which developers are working with, what is that abstraction of the complexity and how much complexity do you expose to the developers so that when they're building with your products, it's smooth and it feels like they're empowered to go faster and that productivity is the most important thing as opposed to the sale or to the daily, monthly active usage and those type of things. Where they come together, in my mind, is kind of goes back to the talk from last year, which is user experience. There's someone who said that user experience is about how you feel about yourself when you're using the product. So if somebody feels really, they're struggling with the product, a lot of times it's like, oh, why am I not understanding it? So that's how I apply them together, but I think they're separate, very separate.
So I think developer experience is the experience of the enablers, or the enablers, or the people that are building the thing. And because of that, as you also hinted at, is the relationship is going to be much, much longer. So you also need to be thinking about how do you keep developers up to date about something that has changed in the product that might affect the things that they've built. Like thinking about the whole life cycle. So it's I think in that it's different because as a user experience is more about like the immediate thing, and developer experience is more this investment thing where you're building for the long haul.
I mean, when you're building a platform, you can't really always predict how people are going to use it either. So it seems like user experience, there's more of a one size fits all, like a single track that people might go down. Whereas with developers, you don't really know what they're going to create with it. And that's kind of the beauty of APIs. But at the same time, Kristen, last year you were talking about like similar pathways. And there are like repeatable developer journeys that these providers will build toward, correct?
I would say so, yeah. We're working on this feature right now, and we're an open source platform. So we talk about what we're working. You can go to the repo, you can see it. And we recently did a community call about this, where we're trying to build composability, so composable units that you can add to your application from the command line. And what's really interesting about what we were doing to craft the developer experience is to watch people in the tests that we set up. And we said that we wanted to run 2 tests. One to see what developers reach for in terms of label or like tuning in order to add their service. So we're trying to abstract away more of the complexity of ARM or Bicep in working with Azure. And so it's like, what do they reach for, and then how do they reach for it, and then meeting them there so that it gives them that familiar feeling that's cohesive with the tool, but also brings in, like if you're going to add a database, or if you're going to add a large language model, or you're going to add something else, it's coming from different places. So you want that feeling of consistency within the tool, but not necessarily trying to force the consistency where it isn't. It's like that's where you get to craft the developer experience.
Interesting. Let's kind of move on. I want to talk about the role of developer experience in the market as it stands today. Do you think it's become more important to API-based business in general, like a focus on developer experience?
I'll go first. Yeah. So, it's gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And as I was hinting at in my talk, there was that moment when the API darlings suddenly got onto the scene, and it was like, oh my God, like we need to be thinking about this, and how can we do developer experience? So I think it's gotten a lot more visibility and importance because of that. Also, you see these platform efforts that are happening inside of organizations that is similar. It's the other side, the flip side of the coin. It's a similar ideas, but applied in a very different place, where it also, I don't think that a couple of years ago, a lot of senior managers would have been like thinking about developer experience,
Or
like
IDP.
Yeah.
Platform. It's kind of a new thing.
It's a new thing. So I think it's definitely having its moment in the spotlight. Now we need to make sure that it fulfills its promise, and that we actually get the organizations the ROI that they've been investing for.
That's super interesting. I wonder if we can bridge the benefits of building for internal developers and the developer experience there to like these partner-facing APIs or public-facing APIs. I would have thought the argument would have come from the inverse. Like here's what we need from a public speaking perspective.
That has flipped.
Yeah,
it has very much, and it's the Gartner hype wave. External APIs very much are in the throat of disillusionment, I think, because management was sold this dream of, invest in this thing, and we're going to be selling this data API, and you're going to make so much money,
right.
And then that didn't happen. So they've come down from that, and then there's been a shift towards platform thinking and like, okay, so now we've got all these developers, this costs a lot of money. If we can get 5% of improvement in the productivity, we're going to save out, I don't know how much and whatever. So I think that's the shift that has happened. But I think regardless, in both sides, how do we get to the plateau of what is it, productivity? Yeah. So I think that's I think the real question.
Cool. Let's go on down the line. Kristen, how do you view the role of developer experience in the market lately?
Well, listening to the talk that Z was talking about today about scraping and web scraping, that probably takes a lot of us back to, I can think of many things that we did screen scraping to until we got to a certain part in the business. and then it warranted building an API, and maybe that was more SOAP or XML or more contract-based where it was like connected directly. But that contract is like a solidification of what we just tested as like a prototype or a spike with the scraping, because it's like you scrape for the data, now your application keeps breaking because the interface keeps breaking, so you're scraping the wrong part of the website. But then you move to an API, and now we're so far with the API contracts that you need an API key. Well, turns out that's not as secure, and we need to start moving away from that. Now we have agents who want to access that data. Oh, well, they don't have an API key, and they don't, like, how long does it take them to get to 0 to API or hello world? It's like quite a bit of time. So now we have maybe a contract heavy. So I also went to the business track, and in that business track, there was a lot of like, what is the value that we're creating? So I think as API practitioners and people who are API providers, we need to really think about what is it that we want folks to be able to accomplish? What is our business model? What is the way that anyone could access it, whether it's a human interface, a developer, an agent, you know, the list just goes on.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's intrinsically tied to the business outcome, and we should build developer experience for
100%.
that. Cool. Ken, any other thoughts?
I think developer experience is everything. APIs are everywhere. API first is here to stay, and I think that the bar has been lowered. There's just a lot more people who are developers, right? They're interacting with these things, and they're effectively developing. And you want to optimize for their experience so they can achieve what they're trying to achieve a lot quicker, a lot more easily. We used to talk a lot about API management, the space of API management, but lately there's been a lot more shift to API development and that whole life cycle, and optimizing that experience of API development so that, you know, to increase productivity.
Right, and there should be a great developer experience, not just for the consumer, but the provider and the people that are creating this stuff as well. I think that's a good point. I want to throw a question at you that I didn't write down here, just to throw things up. There's been a lot of talk around developer productivity engineering. It was kind of sparked by that McKinsey article. I think a lot of people are aware. Do you think that's like hurt or helped the argument for improving developer experience? And what are the parallels between productivity and, you know, improving developer experience? Maybe Kristof, you want to kick this one off?
I guess probably the parallels are who's paying for developer experience is probably the same persona that's paying for productivity, or they're probably the budget for developer experience improvements is going to come from someone who's seeking, like at least, especially on the inside, seeking an improvement in productivity and a cost reduction and so on. So from that perspective, it's also, there's all these perverse effects of, like you're dealing with a social technical system, and I think that with developer productivity, you have to watch out a lot, because you might be getting unintended consequences if you just blindly start measuring and going for things. So I think that the developer experience way is more of an indirect way, where you're saying, we're just going to make things smoother and easier, and then hopefully it's going to get better. Where the productivity side is like, okay, where's my
productivity? Is it something else? Entirely?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Any other ideas?
I mean, I think that there's two things that come to mind, and one of them is that productivity, I think, was used, I don't know what the right word is, abusive feels a little too strong, but like the idea of like management, like how are you, you know, much are you producing, and
churning out.
And that word has a connotation to it then from there, like a negative connotation. Whereas when I think about productivity on the other side of it, it's like, okay, I have to investigate what's going to be the best thing to use as a tool that's open source for search on this particular web page I'm using, and I have a lot of other things to do. So how fast can I build that prototype? How much of a headache is it going to be for me to maintain this? How much is, like, what goes into everything? And so my personal productivity, I think even Z mentioned that again in his talk. He was like, well, I don't have time for that. I'll just go this route, or I'll go this route. So and therefore, I think developer experience, like if we don't think about the business and the personal productivity and the satisfaction of being able to move to your next task or to how much maintenance it takes, then APIs will not be relevant. We'll be spending so much time in the like details of making this API perfect when people are just trying to run their business and move forward on their ideas. So that's kind of how I think about productivity, as maybe we need a different word for it now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on anytime you try to measure something, it gets a little weird, right? And I find that these measures of activity, a lot of times you're measuring output and not outcomes, right? You're measuring activity, and so you're kind of trying to measure the things that are easy to measure, but they're only an indirect proxy for what really matters, right? What really matters are business outcomes. So I think it becomes a little artificial if you try to put a fine point on it and measure these easy to measure things and assume that that's a great proxy for productivity.
Yeah, a lot of these metrics aren't exactly indicative of the end
Right.
results and could be biased.
Yeah.
For sure. All right, let's bring it a little bit more back to home. I'd like to talk about, what does a quality API developer experience look to you, and what examples on the market do you think are great developer experiences, whether it be APIs or other software?
I'm going to be so the Developer Portals Awards, there you can see a lot of examples in very specific categories. That said, I'm going to be a little bit contrarian because
Should have gone that way.
because I think I don't think that we need to think maximalist about developer experience. I think that there is a just enough way of thinking about it where any kind of access always bounces back and gets you to swing back into this didn't pay off, so it must be worthless. So how do we hold back a little bit so that we don't go crazy, but we are actually doing this deliberately in a responsible ROA way. And I think that's the, because we sometimes see organizations come to us we want fantastic developer experience. And okay, but to do that, you need to surprise people, make them make something interesting that's going to delight them. This costs a lot of work, and also after a few times, that delightful thing might no longer be delightful. It might actually become something that just annoys you and that's just sitting in a way. So that means that you have to spend a lot of effort to really stay on top of that. And unless you're really making money selling APIs, maybe you can't afford that. And then, so think about it from that perspective. Be realistic in your your goals, and think about the business impact that you're going to have, and how can you facilitate that, balance that out, so that you're thinking about developer experience, you're thinking about operational maturity, how easy is it to for developers to add their interfaces to your platform. And also think about the business value, how are you generating value for the organization?
Gotcha.
Well, you mentioned Plaid in your talk, right? So I think Plaid is an underrated, or maybe people don't know as much about it, but that's a great developer experience. The canonical developer experience being Stripe and Twilio. If you really ask yourself why, it's interesting because I saw a talk a year or two ago where they peeled back the documentation to the API for both of them, actually, and they were very inconsistent, and there was a lot of things in there that would lead you to believe it's not such a great developer experience. But I can tell you firsthand, we built an API platform to all the mobile phone carriers in the US and in Canada, and that's hard. That's really hard to do. All the different credit checks you have to do, the making sure your product has the very specific connectivity to that device and not another device, and just all these little tiny details between the connectivity with the telecoms. And the same thing with building, I have a big background in retail, working at BestBuy.com and mobile and et cetera. PII, SOX compliance, all these things, really, really, really hard. And so I think Twilio and Stripe are the canonical example because, one, they go back to what we were just talking about. They solve a hard business problem that abstracts away any kind of payment infrastructure or telecom infrastructure. And then second, they make developers, I think they make us feel seen because, first of all, when you go to their website, it's crafted beautifully, and we care about things that are we're builders. And so we're wow, you built this thing that's beautiful. They put up billboards that say, ask your developers, yeah, ask us. like how to solve this problem. Don't make a, so the timing is right, the craftsmanship, solving real business problems. But I think that the developer experience, if you're solving a real business problem that's hard and you're abstracting that away, that's what the developer experience is. And even if you have some flaws in your documentation or how your API functions, I think we're willing to overlook that.
It's worth it.
Yeah, to me, a great UX, a great DX is one that doesn't insult your developer's intelligence.
Exactly.
And so developers are smart. They're trying to get things done. I really like what you said in your talk, where it's not about eliminating friction entirely. It's about optimizing the friction. Right. Without friction, there's no traction. Right. So you're trying to get something done. So it's all about trying to minimize the friction and make sure the friction occurs in the right places, and automating and obviating the toil away, keeping it out of the path of a developer, and really helping the developer stay in that zone as much as possible, right? Keep in the flow, get in the flow, keep in the flow, and help them get their jobs done.
Let's move on to the elephant in the room, the big AI question. How do you see AI as evolving the current API developer experience?
Ooh, developer experience specifically. So, so I think that we've seen some people in the community trying to do like a bot that is just going to generate code for you. I'm scared of that stuff. Just because the systems so we've done this like 180 degrees flip, where software used to be deterministic. Like you built something and it was hopefully, or it was supposed to always do the exact same thing. Now we've got this system that's on purpose non-deterministic, where actually the unpredictableness is a feature. And so I think using LLMs for actually creating the developer experience, I think is scary. On the other hand, using LLMs to generate great drafts for documentation that is going to accelerate you making better documentation, that's a fantastic idea. So that's a part of the core things we learned from the AI the Docs micro event. Yeah. So that was one of the key things was, person in the loop, or how do you call it? Human in the loop. Yes. Thank you. So human in the loop, really important. Making sure that. Do use it, but don't expose it necessarily to customers.
I mean, we keep seeing AI being embedded not just in developer interactions, but in like user interfaces lately. And to your point, like there's that disclaimer under every little AI suggestion. It's like this tool might be incorrect.
Yeah.
Like see all this cool AI development, and then if you look a little closer, you see that disclaimer everywhere. So yeah, I think there's a reason to be concerned there for sure. Any other ideas down the line here, Kristen?
Well, I mean, that's just what my whole talk is about tomorrow. So I have a lot of thoughts about this. The first being, it makes, when you think about the disclaimer, we have to think about where we are in this journey, and I'll talk a lot about that in my talk tomorrow. But where we are in this journey is like, think back to when you were using Netscape Navigator, it would never work for today, right? So we still have a long ways to go in this journey, and it's really early. And there's no all or nothing. So when we think about coding examples and how LLMs writing code, I think about it as more nuanced. So for example, when Josh was doing his demo on stage today, I don't know if anybody caught that, but he basically wrote the yes, like the function for like if you vote yes and then if you vote no, and then when he was going to print out the results, GitHub Copilot basically did that for him. So it didn't just write all of his code. Mm-hmm. It took the first two things that he did and said, it looks like you're going to want to do this, which is what an LLM is really good at, is that nearest neighbor, like what's the next word? There's so many studies in the science of AI around how LLMs work because of how many words are used like in a whole entire text and then breaking that down. So it's all pretty scientific. It's just so early in the journey. I do think what you were saying about friction, though, and traction is kind of what I hope happens, because obviously we can't, I see the APIs are delivering so much of the AI models or the the feature itself. But where is the APIs with the data? Like, it's just not really coming together in that machine-to-machine way. It's more like screen scraping. So I hope that puts some friction on us to figure out what is that new contract with APIs and what that developer experience looks like. But yeah, writing code, it's not like write the whole application, which I think is a misconception and people think of, but it's more like, you just did this and this, now let me make this next line easier.
Yeah.
So, to me, you got to think it's not replace, it's augment, right? So it's not taking the place or completely replacing the need for developers or developers' intelligence in doing things, but it's there to assist. So think speeding up tasks that require a lot of manual effort or a lot of manual searching. If you can automate a lot of that and bring some results for a developer to review, that gives a developer a leg up. Automating generation of boilerplate code, right? Straightforward CRUD type operations, right? Having a developer type all those things out just doesn't make sense today. And so that's how I think about it. And so if you think about the tasks that a developer performs on their day to day, if you take some of the more tedious things that are not really, don't require a lot of creative effort, but they're just repetitive types of tasks, look to AI to automate a lot of those things and to help the developer focus their time and energy on the things that do require more creative, more intelligent interactions.
Cool.
I have one more to add. So I was at this event where there were, a lot of events I've seen this, no AI without APIs. Like that's like coming out of the tap everywhere. Maybe there's no AI without developer experience. And because so there's the scraping part, yes. But I think if you're really going to go towards this dream of like agents that do stuff on behalf of us, then we'll need a lot more documentation, and we'll need a lot better developer experience. Well,
especially if the agents are going to actually get behind that monetization wall and make real calls that require some sort of business there.
Yeah,
we have a long ways to go to really enable that and make it a stable process, I think.
For sure.
Fascinating. All this is very cool, very future looking. I would like to ground things a little bit more into like some practical advice maybe about like what are your favorite things to see in API documentation and playgrounds, like code samples in all the major languages, 3-column layout, API key rotation. Like what are those practical things that are just best practices, expectations these days that people in the room should be building toward?
Oh, there's so many. So,
I want a list.
Throw
it on the screen.
So I think I'm going to do contrarian because I think that's where the most value lies. Do you have good business documentation about your API? Do you actually explain what it does? What is it good for? Because one of what we have seen with customers and in the wider community is that most of the time all these efforts fail with just purely documentation. And just your reference documentation is not enough. You need to have, something that explains what this is good for so that people can actually find it.
Human readable description.
Yes.
And especially about the performance behaviors too.
Yeah.
Rate limiting, stuff like that.
That's really important.
Anything else? Yeah.
I think the very first top of mind thing is you talked about key rotation. We, with security, that's like our number one priority at Microsoft. I mean, just like when we're open source with our code, you all can read most of Satya's emails he puts out on the blog. And I think he said something like, do you have a feature to build or, do you have a security thing to attend to or do you have a feature to build? No, you don't, right? Like security first. And we have a ton of sample applications, so not just sample snippets of code, but fully working applications, like 130, 40 of them. So basically you can go there and initialize one of these applications. You can go through all the code, look at all of it, and then you can just pull it back down and destroy all the resources so that you can learn and see it fully working. So it's not just a sample here or code snippet there, but it's like a fully working, this is how it's all connected. And in that journey, people from the community will also submit these applications because they want to promote whatever it is that they're showing off, the feature that's in there, that they want to show it working with a full-fledged application. And that's one of the things that we advise on, is that we don't want API keys in the application. We'd rather have them in the key vault as a secondary, but the first is managed identity. And so we've been teaching a lot of developers about managed identity, and I thought perhaps we'd see a little bit more pushback from developers, but most developers are like, oh, didn't know about this, okay, and then we guide them through it and everyone's happy. But right now, security is probably one of our biggest concerns across the globe, and if you're building anything, security should definitely be top of mind for developer experience, and sometimes that means the experiences developers are learning from you and your platform how to accomplish that.
I mean, to your point, the Getting Started Guide for Security seems like a obvious example. We see that on a lot of API developer portals.
Right, or like when you see that somebody needs, like, how many of you run into a CORS error? Like, yes, it's terrible. And so when you just look it up, there's all this documentation. So if you know that there's a certain thing that people are struggling with, either learning new secure by design practices or CORS errors, like maybe write a blog about it and get some of the education first as the developer experience, and then people might learn about you because you helped them first. So help first and start there.
Yeah, I mean, Hello World doesn't cut it anymore, right? So it's great to have these examples that you can interact with and experiment with, but you need these things to support your real world demands of the applications you're trying to build. So it's really all about the non-functional requirements in my mind, right? And so you need to be able to embrace and be customizable and support the various patterns that real developers are having to deal with in their real environments. So take those non-functional requirements into account when providing these playgrounds.
That's a really good point. I'd like to open the floor. I have some more questions here, but it'd be nice to see what other people are thinking. Anyone have any other ideas for the panel discussion here that we'd like to ask our panelists? Let's get around the room a little bit.
I can shout.
Oh, sure.
Maybe opposite.
But for the
recording, it does help. I'm still a little low on this guy. Check. Okay, that's better.
Thanks. My name is Joachim, work at SEB. So maybe listen to the opposite then. So what not to do in terms of developer experience?
Good question. Yeah. What makes a really bad, lousy developer experience?
Hide your docs. Like if your documentation is behind a login wall, that's terrible. I think that's like one of the and it happens a lot. I know there's business reasons for it, but try to be as open as you possibly can, because that's going to make discoverability and findability better.
So we shouldn't be sending PDFs over email?
Oh God, no. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, locking anything behind a talk to a salesperson or email, that's just not how developers work. They will move on, we will move on. Whatever you can get going, it's got to be past Hello World. So docs behind, that's probably, I would say, number one.
Yeah, if you're going for developer-led growth, if your model is like sales engineers, it might be different. I don't know.
Yeah, and don't insult intelligence. But the key is knowing your audience, right? So knowing who you're catering to and the real world challenges that they're having to deal with and supporting those. You're not there to just sell, you're there to really optimize their experience. So put your feet in their shoes, deal with real world concerns that developers need to deal with on a day-to-day. That's how to get it done.
And I think don't wait until it's already a known thing, because I think docs is the number one thing we'd all come up with to say don't do. But thinking about like API keys, that's one of the biggest things that's going to quickly become a developer experience no, because they just get leaked, they're in repos, and so how do you get ahead is probably where I would like start to look at the landscape, and then as something's moving in a direction, see if that's going to quickly become a developer no that you want to like move away from. Or I can't remember exactly what word you used. Things not to do. Yeah.
Anti-patterns.
Anti-patterns.
I will substantiate everything they just said, those panelists, with the latest Postman report. I think it was like a lack of documentation was the top hindrance to API usability. And then I believe the second was just discovering or finding them is just as hard. So yeah, we have some work to do. Any other questions? Yeah, Jeremiah.
So I was working with an engineering team, and we were doing this integration with a very common, well-known payment invoicing solution. And this integration took forever. It had a lot of terrible things about the design of the API, and I could finally have real-world experience to say that developer experience really doesn't matter if that's what your finance team wants at the company. So, but one of the biggest challenges we had in this whole integration process was not the API docs, but actually understanding like the business domain model for this product that we were integrating with. And it used terms and words in completely different ways than our own finance department used, or I think what people might normally associate with those words to mean. Do you have what are your great examples that you can think of for providers who do a really good job of explaining like their particular complex domain model, which might be a prerequisite to actually doing a technical integration well?
That's a great question. Who wants to kick this one off? I mean, every industry has its own set of jargon, right? Mm-hmm. And if that's not understood by the consumer, it's going to hinder the developer experience. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the more anyone can use plain, direct language, especially thinking about all the different angles of communication. So there's the different domains, but many of us speak different languages. And if we're writing our docs in English and only translating them to one or two languages, that might be somebody's second language. So there's just so many reasons to be clear and direct and use this plain language. I know that a lot of times we want to be creative and fancy and come up with these new names and be known for them. Well, that's not discoverable by agents and SEO, and it might sound cool, but I think that's one way to do it. Another is architectural diagram. So actually helping people see past the words so that they can see pictorially and visually like how the things come together in terms of the business model.
Yeah, there's so many bad examples. That's like so many organizations that are fully inside out, like, you know, they have like all their departments and they have these really weird names for their products that don't make any sense at all. And then that's how the API is called. And I think we would almost, I wonder if this is what we're going to go towards, that like a universal interface language or something like that, where, but I don't know if it's possible. It sounds a lot like the whole RDF world and semantic web, but maybe there's ideas there. I don't know. I probably will need it because you don't want to explain why you called your product something that means something completely different. But a really good example does not come to mind right away. Yeah.
I mean, there's only so much you can learn from an interface, and I think that's the challenge a lot of us have with APIs. There's a conceptual model, right, that this API is designed to interface with, and that's what's lacking a lot of the times is like the essence of what are all the objects involved here and how do they relate to one another and what are the constraints. You can't get those directly from an endpoint, right? Mm-hmm. They're maybe over time you can recognize some semantic constraints, but really what you need is a primer for understanding what is this thing an interface to, and go past just what are those interactions, what are the different endpoints, but what is this conceptual model of the thing you're interacting with. And a lot of the poor API experiences I've dealt with are ones that just kind of skip over that step. They don't give you any of that context. And you really need the primer before you start interacting with the API.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if everyone quite heard exactly what you said that was so important, Jeremiah. There was like one sentence where you said, it doesn't matter if your business wants it, what the developer experience is, because that's the tool, that's the business model they picked. So this is why, going back to our original talk a little ways back around why it's so important that the two are making sense together. and giving a frame of reference of that to the real world. So if you're going to go really far off, having something that shows somebody where they are in relative space to what they already know. So, for example, we talk about Stripe being the canonical example. Like, if you go to Stripe's website, they have a credit card, and then they show a little bit of code, and then they visually show how it's calling the back end. So you can already take, even if you're not a developer, even if you've never seen code in your life, you still probably have used a credit card. And so there's like a frame of reference that is helpful for becoming the base camp for the new information.
And there's some research. Michael Mang was doing research into some of this because different people need different levels of information. So you might have a beginner user that needs to be explained everything from scratch, and you might have an advanced user that gets really annoyed by all this lengthy information that you're giving out. So and he was doing research about this a couple of years ago. I don't know if he's done anything recently, but there was Michael Mang in Germany from Merseburg University. Yeah.
We had a speaker at the Austin API Summit earlier this year talk about universal or basic English, using that to avoid like the different ways we speak in English that other people in the world might not quite understand. I think that could help as well to get complex things across. Also, there's just so many naming inconsistencies between a lot of APIs and the solutions they're trying to reference. It's, that can drive me crazy as well. Chris?
Hi. I'm just wondering, do any of you have an opinion on whether the new Erazo specification will help improve developer experience?
Ooh.
Let's go there.
I think so, but at the same time, I think that the question will be about how much effort will it be to create those specifications, because like we already now, without the specification, we have problems getting people to actually create documentation. So now you know we're raising the bar again. So will it help if you have them? For sure. that's but I think that's going to be the question. It's like, how many are there actually going to be produced? Can we maybe automate it? Maybe then there will be a lot, and then maybe then they'll help a lot. But yeah, that's probably the question.
I think it will be interesting because there's a shift that we're seeing in SDKs being produced by API producers, and we talked a little bit about this last year, about that shift being more at runtime and API consumers building what they need of the slice. And so if those tooling that we start to build is built on other specifications, then that brings in a little bit of complexity. But we have that a lot with different, like if you're building with type, like if you're using JavaScript, other things can compile to JavaScript. And so you could have different ways of working idiomatically in other ways, but all compile to a similar thing. So it'll just be interesting to see how the different specs work with other tools and components and interoperability between how to actually deliver at the end of the day what they're trying to build or to surface. But yeah, I think it will help some, but it will also add more complexity.
Yeah, I think design first is key. So regardless of what spec language you use or what format, the key is getting that design to happen. Be intentional about these APIs. Mm-hmm. And we have a hard enough time getting people to use specs today as it is, right? Yeah. So getting design first is where we need to be.
Yeah, great question. It's still quite a developing standard. We'll see how people adopt it in practice. Yeah, over here.
Hi. I have a question about like what I've seen by integrating a lot of like services and stuff, like to glue them together. You sometimes see this gold rush. We need an API thing, which is like we have a front end and just expose the backend API to your customers, and that is like not the best user experience because, as the other person already told, you have a lot of like domain objects which are or actions which are only make sense for that UI, but not for a general purpose API. How do you convince like your third-party API that they need to invest or design for not their own use case, but for external use cases or integrations?
So we're back at the social problems. So, yeah.
I don't have a good question for this one, or answer for this one.
I would agree about the social problems, and it's like Conway's Law
Yeah.
is really at play when you look at the organizational structure of people gets represented in the structures that they're building in whatever
Yeah.
architectures, whether that be even physical. And so there's only so much you can solve with technology.
It depends on how valuable it is.
Yeah.
If this is like a slightly important API, but like what Jeremy was saying, like if your CFO or if somebody high enough in your organization says you have to use this, doesn't all really matter. And then will your organization actually care enough to go and re-architect things for that purpose? So it depends. What's the ROI?
So purpose is the key word there, right?
Yeah.
Like being clear about what is the purpose of a given API and who is it designed for and what is it designed for, right? And I think trying to take one API and cater to all audiences for all purposes will take you down a very bad path.
I would just say customer evidence too is a great way
Yeah,
to come
yeah.
forward, is to show the need or show the pain or demonstrate that this isn't my opinion, this is what I'm seeing, and then bring that forward.
Because you're fighting like the organizational structures and organizational inertia. Yeah, it's really, really, really hard. Like, how is it going to get funded? Do you have like a cross-silo effort to fund this thing that is going to have actually the experience that you're supposed to have, but it just doesn't work the way that your organization works, like the way you said, like Conway's Law. It's enough evidence that it's worth it, probably, and then go high enough, I guess. Yeah.
That feels great. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, offered a lot of helpful insights. Thank you so much for coming up here. I thought that was a great discussion.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for having us. Yep.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.